Love, Loss, and Healing, a Journey of Acceptance and Release. I didn't expect to find anything when I opened that old external hard drive, the one buried under papers and tangled charger cables at the back of my desk drawer. It was supposed to be dead, long since forgotten, another casualty of the dozen moves I'd made since college. But as my fingers ran across its worn plastic shell, and the familiar LED flickered back to life, I felt something twist inside me. Faint at first, but insistent, like an echo you can't locate. I wasn't looking for memories, not really. I just wanted to free up space on my laptop. But that's the thing about ghosts. They don't ask for permission. They live where you leave them. The folder was named Miscellaneous. Nothing dramatic. Just a quiet label masking a vault of things I never meant to look at again. Inside were blurry screenshots, PDFs of expired plane tickets, photos of half-eaten meals, and beneath it all, a file named Kusjagi. No capitalization, no date, just us, like whoever saved it was certain the person opening it would know exactly what it meant. And I did. Even before the image loaded, I could feel the heat of that afternoon, the way the sun had kissed the side of her neck while she laughed at something I said. It was that photo. I hadn't seen it in years. We were at the lake house, not ours, just borrowed for the weekend from a friend of hers I never met. She'd packed the cooler. I brought the camera. We argued in the car for an hour because I forgot the wine she asked for, but the moment we arrived, everything melted away. That was always her gift, turning tension into laughter. She wore my oversized hoodie even though it was July, claiming it smelled like safety. I remember how she curled her legs under her as she sat on the wooden dock, watching the waves like they were telling her secrets. And I remember thinking I could stay in that moment forever. I told myself I would remember it all, but time is cruel, and I forgot so much. The picture brought it back with a vengeance. We were smiling, both of us caught in the middle of something unposed, something real. Her hand rested lightly on my knee, and mine was mid-air, gesturing wildly as I told some story I've since forgotten. There was a calm in the image, a warmth that pulsed louder than any words we ever said. But I should have deleted it. Years ago, I should have dragged it to the trash and emptied the bin, because seeing it now felt like tearing open a healed wound and pouring salt straight in. When people ask why we broke up, I tell them we grew apart. It's the easy answer, the socially acceptable way of saying, I didn't know what I had until I ruined it. But the truth is never that neat. There's always a string of small choices, missed glances, unspoken resentments that coil around each other until they choke everything good. We were perfect in moments, but terrible in maintenance. She needed presence. I offered promises. She asked for connection. I handed her distractions. And the worst part, I knew I was doing it. I just didn't know how to stop. I remember the last night clearly. That's the funny thing about endings. They burn brighter in memory than beginnings. We were in the same apartment, but in different worlds. She sat on the couch, scrolling aimlessly through her phone, while I stared at the blinking cursor on my laptop screen, pretending to write. There was music playing. Soft, wordless, the kind she used to hum to while doing dishes. But that night she was silent. I didn't ask her what was wrong. I knew she had told me 100 times before, in 100 different ways. But I kept waiting for the words to change. I kept hoping she'd say, "It's fine," and mean it. She left the next morning, not with a dramatic slam of the door or a suitcase dragged through the hallway, just a soft click and the quiet that followed. I didn't chase her. I told myself it was because I respected her choice, but really it was fear. Fear that if I ran after her, she'd ask me to prove I could be the man she needed, and I wasn't sure I could. Or worse, she wouldn't ask me anything at all. After that, the weeks blurred. I tried dating. I tried deleting her number. I tried forgetting the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was nervous or how she always sniffed books before reading them. Nothing worked. Time didn't heal. It just rearranged the furniture inside my head until I couldn't tell what was memory and what was guilt. So when that photo flashed on my screen, me, her, the lake, the sunlight kissing our silhouettes, it felt like being punched in the chest by a version of myself I no longer recognized. I should have closed the folder, ejected the drive, moved on. But instead, I zoomed in. I studied every pixel, hoping to find a crack in the image, a sign that it was always doomed. But all I saw was joy. Honest, unfiltered, fleeting joy. The kind that doesn't ask for forever. The kind that just is. And that's when the real twist came. As I stared at the screen, something shifted. It wasn't sadness I felt. Not entirely. It was gratitude, sharp and aching. Because for all the things we got wrong, for all the wounds we couldn't stitch, we had that. We had a moment so pure it still made my heart stutter years later. Not everyone gets that. Some people go their whole lives without it. I copied the photo to my desktop, not because I wanted to relive the past, but because I needed a reminder of who I was, of what I was capable of feeling, of what it looked like to love without armor. I didn't know if I'd ever see her again. I didn't even know if she was still in the same city. But that didn't matter. The past didn't owe me a future. It had already given me enough. Still, I couldn't help but wonder what she'd think if she saw it now. Would she remember the fight on the way there, or just the warmth of the sun on her shoulders? Would she smile, or would she feel that same sharp H I did? The questions didn't have answers, but they didn't need to. The photo was never about what we became. It was about who we were, if only for a moment. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The days after finding the photo were quiet in a strange way, not the comforting silence of being alone with your thoughts, but the heavy kind that presses in from all sides, like the air just before a storm. I kept the image on my desktop, unopened, just a small thumbnail staring back at me every time I minimized a window or shut down for the night. I didn't click on it again. Not because I didn't want to, but because I knew I couldn't handle falling back into it. But it was there, whispering, reminding, waiting. And even though I tried to focus on work, on errands, on cooking meals I never finished, the truth was I started remembering things that hadn't crossed my mind in years. It was never just about her, not really. It was about who I became when I was with her. That version of me who looked up from screens, who asked questions just to hear her answers, who could sit in stillness without the anxious twitch of needing to do something. That man felt like a stranger now. These days, I ran on autopilot. Filled the space she left with tasks and to-do lists, anything to avoid that knowing hollow inside. But the photo had cracked something. It wasn't a breakdown, not yet. It was a reckoning. I found myself retracing old routines, passing the bakery we used to stop at on Sunday mornings, walking the long way home past the bench where we shared ice cream in the middle of winter. I didn't mean to. My body moved before my mind could stop it, and with every familiar corner came a memory. The time she lost her mitten, and we searched in the snow for half an hour only to find it tucked in her coat sleeve. The night we danced on the roof under fairy lights, our playlist buzzing through a single speaker we balanced on a ledge. None of it was monumental. That's what made it unbearable. The small things, the ordinary magic of loving someone every day in 100 forgettable ways. I guess that's why I finally called Mason. He was one of the few people who knew both of us, who saw the rise and fall without choosing sides. We hadn't spoken much since the breakup. My doing, mostly, but when he picked up, there was no hesitation in his voice. "I was wondering when you'd reach out," he said, like he'd been expecting it. We met at a coffee shop downtown, the kind of place with peeling paint and too loud jazz. And we talked like people who used to be close and didn't know how to stitch the years back together. "She's good," he said. When I finally got around to asking, works at a nonprofit now, teaches art to kids, still forgets to charge her phone half the time. I nodded, unsure what to do with the image of her life continuing without me. It wasn't jealousy exactly, more like disorientation. You spend so long imagining a future with someone that seeing them build one without you feels like watching your own reflection walk away. She asked about you once. Mason added, after a sip of lukewarm espresso. A while back. I think she wanted to know if you were okay but didn't want to ask. I laughed, short and hollow. Well, that makes two of us. There was a pause then, heavy and unspoken. Mason tapped his fingers on the ceramic cup. She still has that painting you gave her, the one with the trees. It's in her bedroom. That struck me harder than I expected. I hadn't thought about that painting in years. I'd made it during one of those restless nights, when I couldn't sleep and tried pouring my thoughts onto canvas instead. It was messy, abstract, barely coherent, but she loved it. Said it reminded her of the woods near her childhood home. I didn't think she'd kept it. She said once that she didn't hate you. Mason continued, quieter this time. Just hated how things turned out. And wasn't that the truth? We didn't explode, we eroded, slowly, silently, until we were two strangers sitting on opposite ends of a shared life, pretending we didn't notice the gap growing wider every day. I left the coffee shop with more weight than I came in with. Not regret, exactly. Not longing. Just this aching awareness that the past wasn't done with me yet. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened my old journal, the one I kept during our time together, filled with fragmented thoughts, overheard conversations, ideas for stories I never wrote. I flipped through it slowly, the pages fragile from time and neglect, and somewhere near the middle, I found a note she had scribbled in the margin of a half-written poem. You always say the right things when you're not trying to. That one sentence did more damage than I expected, because it was true. I was always better on paper than in person. Always more open in letters than in conversations. Maybe that's why I started writing her an email that night. I didn't plan to send it. It was just a way to clear the noise, to pour out the thoughts I couldn't say aloud. I told her about the photo, about the lake, about how I still didn't know what to do with the memory of us. I wrote for hours, not editing, not censoring, just letting it spill. When I finished, I read it twice, then saved it as a draft and shut the laptop. The next few days were strange, not painful, not peaceful, just strange. I kept expecting to feel some kind of resolution after writing that message, but instead, everything felt suspended. Like I was waiting for a sign I hadn't earned. And then, 3 days later, it happened. An unknown number, a call I almost ignored, but something made me answer. The voice on the other end was soft, familiar. She didn't say my name, just, "Hey, I heard you've been thinking about me." I froze. For a second, I thought maybe I was dreaming. Mason told me, she added, sensing my silence, about the photo, the painting, the coffee shop. I swallowed hard, unsure what to say. Yeah, I managed, finally. I didn't mean for him to. It's okay, she interrupted. I'm glad he did. There was a pause, not awkward, just full, like we both knew the weight of what wasn't being said. I don't know what this means, I confessed. I'm not calling to fix anything. I needed to remember. While she exhaled, and I could almost hear her smile. Mem too. We talked for a while after that. Not about the past, not about the breakup, just life. Books we'd read, places we wanted to visit. I told her about the stray cat that started showing up on my fire escape. She told me about the kid in her class who painted a blue horse because red was too angry. It was strange and lovely and fragile. And when we hung up, she said, "Take care of yourself," in that soft way she used to, like it was a secret only we understood. I didn't expect more. I didn't hope for a second chance. Life doesn't always offer those. But I did go to bed with a strange calm that night. And for the first time in a long while, I dreamed of the lake. Not the fight, not the hoodie, not the forgotten wine, but just the sound of the water and the warmth of her hand in mine. The way it was, the way it would always be, in that one perfect frame of time. And the next morning, the photo was still there on my desktop, but it didn't hurt to look at it anymore. Not quite. A week passed, maybe more. Time blurred in that way it does when you're not waiting for anything but aren't entirely at peace either. I didn't reach out to her again. She didn't call me. And that was okay. That one conversation had given us both something we didn't know we needed. A quiet recognition that the thread between us wasn't entirely cut, just loosened, frayed around the edges. It didn't mean we'd sew it back into the same fabric, but it meant we could stop pretending we'd burned it completely. And that mattered. I started going through the rest of the old hard drive, thinking maybe there were other pieces of me I had abandoned too early. Most of it was clutter. Badly written drafts of half-finished essays, audio files of street sounds I once thought I'd use for a short film, clips from vacations I barely remembered taking. But then I found a folder named Backups. Inside it were dozens of voice memos I didn't recognize at first. And then, halfway through one named Simply Walk, I heard her voice. She was laughing, breathless, unguarded. The kind of laugh that comes when you finally said something so dumb it circles back to being brilliant. And beneath it, my voice, louder than I remembered it, teasing her about getting lost. It was from that trip upstate. The one where we tried to follow a nature trail and ended up 3 miles off course with no signal and only a bag of pretzels between us. I hadn't known she was recording. At the end of the clip, I said something I don't recall ever saying. If we get eaten by beers, at least I'll die next to someone who can't read a map but makes a good last meal. I sat there, headphones still on, not knowing whether to laugh or cry. I did both, I think. It was such a ridiculous thing to say, but I could hear how full of love it was. How unafraid. I used to be like that, carefree, reckless, open. When did I stop? I think part of me believed that moving on meant forgetting. That to heal, I had to erase. But healing, I was learning, didn't mean amnesia. It meant being able to remember without breaking. It meant being able to hold the joy and the hurt in the same hand and not feel consumed by either. And strangely, the more I revisited those fragments, the more I felt like myself again. Not the version molded by grief or guilt, but the one who existed in those photos, those memos, those blurred seconds. Something inside shifted. I started painting again. Not for anyone else, just for myself. I pulled out the brushes she once bought me, the ones I'd packed away the day she left, because I couldn't bear the thought of using them. I painted without a plan, let the colors bleed, let the brushstrokes get messy. It wasn't about creating something beautiful. It was about letting the silence break open. And then, one afternoon, I got an email. The subject line simply read, "He." My heart paused as I clicked it. I've been thinking about that day at the lake, about how still the world felt, about how safe. I found a photo too. One I took when you weren't looking. You were skipping stones and frowning because they wouldn't go far enough. You looked ridiculous and perfect. I still have it. I don't know why I'm telling you this. Maybe because I finally can. There was no signature. But I didn't need one. I knew. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't need to. It was her way of saying she remembered too. That the good hadn't been erased by the ending. That we both carried it still. In the days that followed, the weather turned warmer. The kind of spring that arrives slowly, teasingly, like it's unsure it's welcome. I started walking more, not with a destination, just to be in motion. I passed couples holding hands, overheard snippets of arguments and laughter, and I felt, for the first time in a long while, like I belonged in the world again, not as a half of something lost, but as a whole person, bruised and still breathing. One evening, I wandered back to that old bookstore we used to visit. It hadn't changed much. The bell above the door still jingled off-key, and the woman behind the counter still wore glasses too big for her face. I browsed without intention until I stumbled on a poetry collection we used to read together. It fell open to a page we'd once marked, and there it was, underlined faintly in pencil. Some loves aren't meant to last, but they're meant to matter. I bought the book. Not out of sentimentality, but out of reverence. Because not every ending needs to be sad. Some are just necessary. Some people aren't meant to stay. They're meant to arrive at just the right time to show you who you are, to teach you how to feel, to remind you that connection is real, even if it's brief. That night, I finally deleted the photo from my desktop. Not because I was erasing her, but because I had already kept what mattered. It wasn't pixels I needed, it was the echo, the warmth, the lesson. And those lived inside me now. But the story wasn't finished yet. Because 3 days later, I saw her. Not in a dream, not in a memory. Standing in the middle of a crosswalk on 6th and Grove, holding a bag of groceries and looking straight at me. We both froze. People swerved around us like we were stones in a river, fixed in place while the world flowed on. She smiled first. Small, cautious. I mirrored it. She took a step forward. I took one too. Neither of us said anything. There was no cinematic reunion, no apology or dramatic kiss. Just two people, older and wiser, standing on a patch of sidewalk where our past met our present. She looked down at the bag in her hand, then up at me again. You still make that stupid face when you're thinking. I laughed. You still wear that coat you hate. She shrugged. It has pockets. We didn't hug, we didn't touch. But the space between us felt smaller than it had in years. I don't know how long we stood there. A minute. Maybe 10. But when she finally said, "Take care of yourself," I nodded. You too. And we walked away, in opposite directions. But this time we didn't look back. The city looked different after that. Or maybe it was me who had changed. That moment on the sidewalk, brief, unscripted, quieter than the world thought closure should be, had rearranged something inside me. Not in a way that cracked open wounds or stirred up false hopes, but in the way that seasons shift subtly, steadily, without asking for permission. I didn't cry when I got home. I didn't replay her voice in my head like a broken melody. I just sat in the stillness, letting it settle over me like snowfall, not heavy, but noticeable. And for the first time in what felt like years, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. I think part of me always expected closure to arrive like a thunderclap, a revelation, a confrontation, something loud and cinematic. But it came in her smile, in the quiet recognition that we had once been something rare and beautiful, and that was enough. We didn't owe each other explanations anymore. The distance between us wasn't filled with blame, just understanding. We had walked through something profound together, and then we walked away from it. That was the truth. Still, life doesn't pause for your inner epiphanies. The days kept coming. Work meetings, laundry, messages from friends I hadn't answered in weeks. The same routines. But something inside them felt lighter, as if the gravity of every decision no longer pressed down so hard. I began showing up for things again. Not just physically, but emotionally. I said yes to invitations without the urge to cancel last minute. I started cooking again, not just microwaving, and I even invited Mason over one night for dinner. He noticed the change before I could say anything. "You look different," he said while poking at the roasted vegetables like he didn't trust them. In a good way. Less haunted. Is that a compliment? "I'm trying," he smirked. "So, are you okay?" I didn't answer right away. I poured us both a drink, leaned against the counter, and said, "I think I'm finally at peace with the idea that some things don't get fixed. They just get finished." But Mason nodded slowly. "That's not nothing." We talked late into the evening. About her, about me, about how the versions of ourselves we carry from the past often don't match the ones we see in the mirror. But that's the work, isn't it? Bridging the gap without falling into it. The next day, I received a package I hadn't ordered. No name, no return address. Inside was a small, square frame with a photo I'd never seen. It was the one she mentioned in her email. The one where I was skipping stones at the lake, frowning like a child who couldn't win a game he made up. I stared at it for a long time, a smile creeping in before I even realized it. On the back, in small handwriting, was a note. "You never saw the ones that went far." That undid me, not in a devastating way, but in a profoundly human one. I sat down right there on the floor and let the emotion sweep through me. Because she was right. I was always too focused on the splash, on the ones that sunk quickly to notice the quiet arcs, the stones that skimmed the surface 3, 4, 5 times before disappearing. And maybe our love had been like that. Low in the beginning, explosive even, but later it was the quiet glides that carried us the farthest, the uncelebrated gestures, the forgiveness, the staying, even when it got hard. I placed the photo on my desk, next to the now dusty sketchbook I had started using again, not as a shrine, as a reminder that I had once loved deeply, that I had once been seen and understood and chosen, and that even though it didn't last forever, it had been real. Not everything real has to last. That's a hard lesson, but a necessary one. In the following weeks, I began to write again. Not journal entries or unsent emails, but stories. Fiction, mostly. Characters who made mistakes and didn't always get the endings they wanted, but still learned something valuable in the process. I didn't try to publish them. I didn't share them. I just wrote because I needed to find my voice again, the one that had been buried under layers of self-preservation and avoidance. It felt like breathing after being underwater for too long. One afternoon, while writing at the park, I noticed someone sketching on a bench nearby. She wasn't her, but she reminded me of her in a way that didn't sting. The way she focused, how her pencil moved with quiet urgency, the way she frowned when something didn't turn out the way she saw it in her mind. I didn't interrupt. I didn't romanticize it, but I did feel something shift again, a door creaking open. It wasn't about finding someone new. It was about realizing I could. That my heart hadn't locked itself in a museum, guarded by velvet ropes and warning signs. That it could still move, still stretch towards something without dragging old shadows behind it. And then, one Friday night, I got a text from an unknown number. "Do you still drink that ridiculous cinnamon tea?" My stomach flipped. Not because I didn't know who it was, but because I did. I sat with it for a moment. Then I replied, "Only when it's cold, and when I'm trying to feel human again." There was a pause. 3 blinking dots. Then, "There's a new tea place near the park. Not as good as the one you liked, but it has chairs that don't wobble. Thought you'd appreciate that." Another pause. No pressure. Just, "If you're curious." I stared at the screen for a long time. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I finally knew I had a choice. I went. Not because I wanted to start over, not because I believed we'd fall back into something we lost, but because I was ready to sit across from her without the weight of history pressing on my shoulders, because I wanted to know who she had become, and I wanted her to meet the version of me that had survived it all. The cafe was quiet, lit by dim bulbs and jazz low enough not to interrupt thoughts. She was already there, nursing a cup, eyes scanning the room like she was preparing herself to be okay whether I showed or not. And when she saw me, she didn't smile right away. She exhaled like she'd been holding her breath without knowing it. I sat down. She slid a cup toward me. "Still too much cinnamon," she warned. I took a sip. It burned. It was perfect. We talked like old friends. No illusions. No unspoken tension waiting to erupt. Just honest conversation about where we'd been, what we'd learned, how we'd failed each other and ourselves. We didn't try to rewrite history. We just let it be a place we'd both lived. And somehow, that made the present richer. When we parted, there was no promise, no plan. Just a hug that lingered a second longer than it needed to, and that was enough. Because sometimes, what matters most isn't what comes next. It's knowing you survived the before. The nights grew longer after that tea shop meeting, but they didn't feel empty. The H I once mistook for longing had been replaced by something softer. Clarity, maybe. Not about her or about what we once were, but about myself. I no longer flinched at the thought of seeing her name, no longer felt the compulsion to replay our memories like a loop of what-ifs. We had both stepped back into each other's lives not to resume, but to reconcile. And that made all the difference. Still, life as always kept its own rhythm. Days unfolded with their ordinary demands. Deadlines, errands, lukewarm coffee. But something had shifted. I approached things with a steadier heart, less consumed by the need to fix or prove. I'd learned the difference between grief and nostalgia, between regret and reflection. And somewhere in that slow burn of self-understanding, I realized I was no longer trying to fill a space. I was simply learning how to let it exist without defining me. One rainy Thursday, I found myself revisiting places I hadn't dared return to since she left. Not because I missed her, but because I missed the parts of myself I used to bring to those spaces. There was a small art gallery tucked between a laundromat and a pawn shop, an unassuming place we used to visit when neither of us wanted to talk but both needed to feel. The walls were still covered in the same muted hues, abstract forms that invited interpretation rather than offered clarity. I wandered from frame to frame, letting my mind wander, until I stopped at a painting I didn't recognize. It was a swirl of colors, chaotic and controlled at once, a tornado contained within a canvas. The plaque beneath it read, "After the storm." I stared for a long time, because that's what we were, wasn't it? The storm and the after. That night, I painted again. Not something sad, not something symbolic. Just the skyline outside my window, the way the street lamps danced across the wet pavement, the way the clouds seemed to pulse under the glow of the city. I didn't think about who would see it. I didn't think about her. I just let my hands move. And when I stepped back, I realized how long it had been since I'd created something without trying to impress or apologize. It felt like waking up from a dream I hadn't realized I was stuck in. Mason noticed too. He swung by one evening, uninvited as usual, with 2 bottles of cheap wine and a box of Thai food. He dropped onto my couch, took one look at the painting drying near the balcony, and grinned. "You back?" he said. "Back from where?" "From wherever you went after she left." I shrugged, unsure if I agreed. Maybe I never left. Maybe I just stopped showing up. He tossed me a spring roll. "Well, you're showing up now. And you don't look like a man clinging to a ghost anymore." That word, ghost, stuck with me. Because that's what she had been, hadn't she? A ghost in my thoughts, in the corners of my routines, in the objects I couldn't throw away. But not anymore. Now she was a person, real, fallible, living her life somewhere out there, just like I was. And that meant I could finally let go of the version of her I'd built from longing and guilt. I could stop loving the echo. The next week, I got an invitation. An art show. Local, small. Curated by a friend of a friend. They'd seen one of my paintings through Mason and wanted to include me. I hesitated, at first. Not because I didn't want to share, but because part of me feared exposure. Being seen in a way I couldn't control. But then I remembered something she once said, when I was doubting myself. "You were always afraid to show the mess. But the mess is the masterpiece." And so, I said yes. The night of the show, I arrived early. My painting was hung near the entrance, the one of the city skyline after the rain. I watched strangers walk by, some stopping, some not, some tilting their heads like they were trying to decode something personal. I didn't hover. I didn't explain. I just let it be what it was, honest. Then, just as the room began to fill, I saw her. She was alone. No dramatic entrance, no accompanying friend. Just her, in a long coat, hair pulled back the way she always did when she was nervous. Our eyes met across the gallery floor, and something electric passed between us. Not romance, not yearning, but mutual understanding. She approached slowly. I met her halfway. "You really did it," she said, glancing at the painting. I guess I did. There was a pause. Not tense. Just full. "Thank you," she said, softly, "for showing it." I wasn't sure what she meant exactly, the painting, myself, the ending. But I nodded. Thank you for coming." We wandered through the gallery together, not touching, not too close, but comfortably in sync. We talked about the other artists, about how we used to argue over which pieces were worth discussing. It was easy. easier than I ever imagined it could be. At the end of the night, she didn't ask for my number. I didn't ask where she was going next. We shared a cab corner, then parted ways with a small wave and a promise unspoken. We had done what we came to do. We had said goodbye the right way this time, and that should have been the end. But life doesn't wrap itself neatly in final scenes. Weeks passed. I moved forward. Fully, this time. I even started dating again. Not out of desperation, but from a place of readiness. Not every date was magical. Some were awkward. Some were fine but forgettable. But I wasn't searching for a replica. I wasn't chasing a feeling I once had. I was showing up as I was, not as who I thought I needed to be loved. And then, on a random Tuesday, I found something tucked inside the back of a notebook I hadn't opened in years. A letter. From her. Handwritten. Dated just days before she left. I don't know how I missed it before. Maybe I wasn't ready to see it. Maybe the universe holds certain truths until we're strong enough to face them. My hand shook as I unfolded it. If you're reading this, it means you're finally ready. I couldn't say everything then. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't think you'd hear it. I know you loved me. I never doubted that. But you loved me like I was a dream, and I needed to be real. You were always waiting for the perfect version of us, and I just needed you to show up for the messy, complicated present. I hope you find someone who lets you be real too. Someone who doesn't flinch when the shine fades. And I hope, more than anything, that you learn to love yourself that way first. No bitterness, no accusations. Just truth. I sat with the letter for a long time, and then I folded it back up and placed it in a small wooden box where I kept other fragments. Ticket stubs, receipts from places that no longer existed, a pressed flower that once meant everything. Not because I needed to cling to the past, but because the past had shaped me. And then I went outside into the cool evening air. And I walked. No destination. No ghosts trailing behind me. Just the quiet certainty that I was finally free. The seasons had turned by the time I fully realized I hadn't thought about her in days. Not in the reflexive way I used to. Not when hearing a song we once played on long drives. Not when folding laundry and finding an old sweatshirt she once wore. Not even when I passed the park bench where we had once argued in the soft, venomless way people do when they still care deeply. The sharpness had dulled, not through force or forgetting, but through the gentle sanding of time and change. The ghost was gone, and in its place stood someone I barely recognized, someone I had become without fanfare, without ceremony. Me? Whole. Again. It was late October now, the kind of crisp where every breath feels cleaner, where the sky glows differently just before dusk. The art show had come and gone, the letter had been read, folded, and tucked away, and my days had adopted a new rhythm. I still painted, still wrote, still drank that strong cinnamon tea more often than anyone should. But I had started letting people in again. Real people. Present ones. There was a woman named Elise. We met in the most ordinary way, at a bookstore, reaching for the same collection of essays. The moment wasn't extraordinary, and maybe that's why it stuck. She didn't remind me of her. That was important. Elise laughed too loud, talked with her hands, got annoyed at slow walkers, and refused to pretend she liked jazz just because I did. She wasn't trying to be anyone's memory. She was rooted in the now, unafraid of her own scars. And with her, I didn't feel the need to prove I'd healed. I just was. And she accepted that. We didn't rush. No declarations. No pressure to fill silence. We went on walks. We shared breakfasts. Sometimes we sat in separate rooms reading. Other times we shared everything. Thoughts, fears, the stupid things we used to believe about love. She once asked about my past, and I told her the truth, not all of it, but the shape of it. She nodded, not with jealousy or judgment, but with that calm understanding only someone who's lost and rebuilt themselves can give. We're all made from pieces, she said once. I just want to know the pieces you still carry. And I realized then, I didn't carry her anymore. I remembered her, yes. I respected what we had, what it taught me. But she wasn't a weight, she was a chapter. A necessary one. The kind that splits the story into before and after, the kind you return to sometimes not to relive, but to remember how far you've come. I think we all imagine our lives as linear until something forces us off the map. For me, that detour had been her, and the pain, and the silence, and eventually the rebuilding. I no longer resented the path. I just didn't need to walk it anymore. One chilly morning in November, as I was cleaning out the storage closet, I found the wooden box again. The one with the letter, the flower, the fragments. I sat down with it, expecting some flicker of emotion, some old tug at my ribs. But instead there was peace. I opened it slowly, sifted through the contents. The ticket stub from the concert where it rained, and we danced anyway. The receipt from that coffee shop with the broken ceiling fan. The letter. I read it again, this time with a different heart. And then, with no fanfare, I let it go. I walked to the river. The same place she and I had once watched fireworks burst across a summer sky. I sat on the edge of the pier and released the items one by one. Not to forget, not to erase, but to honor. Each object fell into the water and floated for a moment before sinking. A goodbye, without sadness. A ritual not of loss, but of gratitude. When I returned home, Elise was there, barefoot, in the kitchen, singing off, key to a song I didn't recognize. She looked up, mid-note, and grinned. "You okay?" I nodded. "Yeah?" "Just lighter." She didn't ask why. She just poured me tea and pressed a kiss to my shoulder as she passed. That was her magic, not needing the whole story to stand beside me in it. And then, one day, an ordinary Thursday, not marked by any cosmic shift or dramatic news, I received an email. No subject, no body, just a single attachment. I hesitated before clicking. It was a video file. I pressed play. The screen showed her, older, brighter, a little softer around the eyes. She was standing in front of a mural, a swirl of color and motion I immediately recognized as her own work. She held the camera at arm's length and smiled, then spoke. "I know we said goodbye, and I meant it, but I found something I thought you should see." She turned the camera slowly to reveal a small plaque at the bottom of the mural. It read, "For the storm and the calm that followed." She looked back at the lens. "That was you. Both of those things. And I'm better for it." And then the video ended. I sat in silence, not out of shock, but awe. We had become each other's art. Not the kind you hang in a gallery for applause, but the kind that lives quietly in corners, in memories, in who we choose to be afterward. We had shaped each other, not through permanence, but through impact. That night, Elise and I walked through the city, coats zipped high, hands entwined, breaths visible in the crisp air. We talked about trivial things, holiday plans, bad commercials, a neighbor who always sang opera too loudly. And I realized how beautiful it was to live in the ordinary again, to laugh without the undertow, to hold someone's hand without the fear of letting go. The past didn't haunt me anymore. It guided me here. And now, here was enough. In the final quiet of that evening, as we stood beneath the soft glow of a street lamp, Elise looked up at me and said, "You're thinking too loud?" I smiled, just remembering something that finally stopped hurting. She leaned into me. "Good. Then maybe it's time to make something new." And just like that, we kept walking into a future no longer haunted by what might have been, but shaped by everything that was, and the freedom of what could still be. And that's the thing no one tells you about healing. Sometimes the story doesn't end with reunion. Sometimes it ends with release. Enjoyed the video? Give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell so you never miss an update.